Her name is Margaret Elaine Calloway, and she is 51 years old. 3 months ago, on an ordinary Tuesday morning in April, she sat at a round table in a conference room she had never visited before, in a building that bore her name on a small brass plaque beside the door. Across from her sat the people who had shaped every early chapter of her life: her mother, her father, and her sister Diane, and not one of them could look her in the eye. There was a letter on the table. It was typed on heavy cream stationery, embossed with the seal of a university, and it said things her parents had spent 30 years pretending were not true. Margaret did not raise her voice that morning. She did not need to. The letter said everything that she had never been allowed to say herself. Before she tells you what happened next, if you have ever sat in a room where the truth finally arrived, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story resonates with you. Drop your city and your local time in the comments below. She loves knowing where you are listening from. To understand what happened at that table in April, you have to go back to a house on Clover Ridge Road in a mid-sized Ohio town called Brenton Falls, where a family of 4 lived in a colonial revival with cream shutters and a mailbox shaped like a covered bridge. The house was neat. The lawn was edged. The neighbors knew the Calloways by their Christmas lights, which went up the weekend after Thanksgiving every year without exception. Gerald Calloway managed the lending department at Brenton Falls Savings and Loan. He wore his ties on a rotating schedule Monday through Friday, and he pressed his own shirts on Sunday evenings while the radio played gospel. He was not a cruel man in the way that novels describe cruelty. He did not shout. He did not break things. His particular variety of coldness was quieter than that. He rewarded performance and found silence adequate for everything else. Patricia Calloway, Margaret's mother, had been a legal secretary before the children arrived, and she carried that precision into her domestic life. Every drawer in the Calloway kitchen had a label. Every birthday card was signed in the same looping script. Patricia had strong opinions about how things looked from the outside, and she organized the family accordingly. She was the kind of woman who said she loved her daughters equally and believed it, the way a person can believe something that has never been examined. Diane was 2 years younger than Margaret and had her father's square jaw softened by her mother's coloring, blonde, pink-cheeked, and loud in the way that large personalities are loud, filling a room simply by entering it. Diane played the flute in the school band, though she was not especially gifted. She was the kind of child who made adults lean forward in their chairs. Margaret was the kind of child who sat in the back of the room and read ahead in the textbook. Margaret did not understand the architecture of her family for a long time. Children rarely do. The understanding came gradually, the way a word you have mispronounced your whole life suddenly sounds wrong to your own ear. There was a Sunday in October when Margaret was 9 years old and Diane was 7. The family had driven to Columbus for the day, a treat that Patricia had announced at breakfast with a clap of her hands, as though the applause were for everyone equally. They went to the art museum first, and Margaret stood for a long time in front of a painting of a woman reading a letter by a window. The light in the painting was the color of butter. She could not stop looking at it. When she finally turned around, her parents and Diane had moved 2 rooms ahead, and no one had noticed she was missing. At dinner that evening at a restaurant with cloth napkins, Margaret's father ordered Diane a dessert with a candle in it because Diane had mentioned in the car that she wished it were her birthday. The waitress brought it out. Diane blew out the candle. Their parents smiled. Margaret ate her slice of chocolate cake quietly and did not say that it was, in fact, her own half-birthday. A fact she had mentioned at breakfast that same morning. It was the kind of moment that would not have registered at all if it had happened once. But it did not happen once. The rare ally in Margaret's life was her father's mother, a woman named Ruth Calloway, who lived 40 minutes away in a town called Harmon, and who drove herself to church until she was 82 years old in a green Buick with a cracked dashboard. Ruth was not a soft woman. She did not use the word feelings without a slight stiffening of the spine. But she noticed things, And she had a particular quality that Margaret came to understand only as an adult. Ruth saw Margaret clearly, without the overlay of expectation, without the soft focus that Patricia applied to Diane. Ruth called Margaret every Sunday evening. She asked about her grades, her books, her opinions. She sent her newspaper clippings about women who had done things: a judge, a surgeon, an architect. She signed her birthday cards with a phrase she used every year without variation: "You are the kind of person the world needs more of, and do not let anyone tell you otherwise." When Margaret was 11, Ruth took her aside at Christmas and pressed a small envelope into her hand. Inside was a card that said nothing except a date and a name: a law firm in Columbus, Hutchins and Greaves, and a woman named Ellen Greaves. Ruth said, "I have put something aside for you, Maggie. Not a lot. But something. You will understand when it is time." Margaret kept the card in the bottom of her jewelry box for 19 years. The first time Margaret understood that the imbalance in her family was not accidental, she was 13. She had won a regional essay competition through the county library system, third place, which came with a certificate and a $25 savings bond. The local newspaper ran a photograph: Margaret in a blue sweater, holding the certificate with both hands, squinting a little into the flash. Her father looked at the photograph when it arrived and said, very mildly, "That's a nice picture of you." Then he folded the paper and set it on the coffee table, and that was the end of it. 3 weeks later, Diane was cast as the lead in the middle school musical. Patricia made 2 phone calls to other mothers within the hour. Gerald rearranged his work schedule to attend every performance. They framed the program and hung it in the hallway. The essay certificate went into a drawer in Margaret's room. She did not think about it again for many years. The second anecdote is from the spring of Margaret's sophomore year of high school, a May that she remembers mostly by the smell of cut grass and the sound of the lawnmower running on Saturday mornings while she studied at the kitchen table. She had been awarded a spot in a summer research program at Ohio State University. A 5-week program for high school students interested in science and medicine, competitive, fully funded, the kind of thing that college admissions offices noticed. She told her parents at dinner on a Friday. Her mother said, "How lovely," and then asked Diane about a class trip she had been planning. Her father asked whether the program would conflict with the family vacation to the lake in August. It would not. He said, "All right then." At the program, Margaret worked in a laboratory studying soil microbiota under the supervision of a woman named Dr. Anita Patel, who told her at the end of the 5 weeks that she had the kind of focused attention that was rare in students twice her age. Margaret put that remark in the same drawer in her mind where she kept the essay certificate. She did not mention the research program again to her parents after she came home. They did not ask about it. The third anecdote takes place in November of Margaret's senior year of high school, the year that mattered. She had spent the fall applying to universities with the methodical care she applied to everything: researching programs, drafting essays, meeting deadlines. She was accepted in December to 3 schools, including her first choice, a program in pre-medicine at Ohio State that would begin the following September. The cost was real: tuition, room, board, fees. She sat down with her parents at the kitchen table and walked them through the numbers. Her father listened. Her mother poured coffee. At the end, her father said, "We have a college fund set aside for both of you girls. It is enough to cover 4 years at a state school with some room." Margaret thanked him and went to her room and sat on the edge of her bed in the dark for a while, her hands folded in her lap, the acceptance letter on the desk behind her. She was going to college. The path was real. She did not know that evening that Diane had already spent a third of that fund. Diane, who was a sophomore that year, had been enrolled in a private fine arts preparatory program in Cincinnati, a program that cost $11,000 per year, a program their parents had mentioned to no one, a program that had been quietly draining the college account for 2 years before Margaret ever sat down at that kitchen table to discuss her future. The fourth anecdote comes from the following August, 3 weeks before Margaret was to leave for Columbus. She was in her room folding laundry when she heard her parents' voices through the wall, not arguing, but using the concentrated, flattened tone that adults use when they are discussing something they have already decided. She stood very still and listened to the shape of the conversation without catching every word. She heard her own name. She heard the name of a community college in Brenton Falls, a local school, a commuter school. She set down the shirt she was holding and went downstairs. Her mother was at the kitchen counter, and she turned when Margaret came in. Her hands were wrapped around a mug, and she set it down carefully. "There is no easy way to say this," she began. "Your father and I have been reviewing the accounts, and with everything Diane's program has required, there simply isn't enough for both of you to go away right now. Brenton Falls Community College is an excellent school. Many people start there and transfer. It isn't a closed door." Margaret looked at her mother. Her mother looked at the counter. Then her father came in from the living room and he said, "We've made the decision. We think it's the right one." Margaret said, "All right." She went back upstairs. She sat at her desk. Her hands were in her lap again, and the light in the room was the late summer kind, golden and heavy, coming through the window in a long bar across the floor. The acceptance letter from Ohio State was still on the desk where she had left it months ago. She picked it up, folded it in half, and placed it in the drawer with the library certificate. Then she opened the bottom of her jewelry box and took out the card Ruth had given her 7 years before. Hutchins and Greaves. Ellen Greaves, a phone number in Columbus. It was a Saturday, September 4th, of that same year. Margaret has given that date to the interviewer twice, unprompted, both times with the same quiet precision, as though it is important to her that the day be recorded correctly. The family had gathered for what Patricia called a send-off dinner, which she framed as a celebration for both daughters. Diane was returning to her program in Cincinnati the following week, and Margaret was beginning classes at Brenton Falls Community College on Monday. Patricia had made a roast and set the table with the good plates. Gerald's brother Robert and his wife Carol were there. Also present were 2 of Patricia's colleagues from the Women's Auxiliary at their church, Helen Marsh and Donna Fielding, women who had known the Calloway children since they were small. 6 adults, 2 daughters, the good plates, the roast, the candles Patricia had found at a half-price sale. Partway through dinner, Gerald lifted his glass and said he wanted to say a few words. He thanked his family, said they were proud of both their daughters, said Diane's artistic gifts were a blessing. He mentioned the name of a junior college in Cincinnati where Diane might eventually earn a degree alongside her arts program. He said it the way men like him said things, as though the decision had always been obvious, as though the world arranged itself according to his understanding of it. He did not mention Ohio State. He did not mention the college fund. He did not mention the word community in connection with Margaret's name. But Robert did. Robert, who had a 3rd glass of wine and a forthright nature, looked across the table at Margaret and said, "So Maggie, Gerald was telling me they redirected the education fund for Diane's program, community college route for you this year. How are you feeling about that?" The table went quiet, in the way that tables go quiet when someone has said the thing that was not meant to be said. Patricia said, "Robert." Gerald set his fork down. Donna Fielding reached for her water glass. Margaret looked at her uncle. She looked at her father. She looked at her mother's face, which had gone the color of the cream tablecloth. She looked at Diane, who was examining her napkin. She said, "I wasn't aware that had been shared outside the family." And then she folded her napkin, placed it beside her plate, and excused herself from the table. She walked up the stairs, which creaked on the 3rd and 7th steps as they always had. She closed her bedroom door behind her. She did not slam it. She sat on the edge of her bed, in the same spot where she had sat the previous December after the acceptance letter arrived, and she listened to the conversation restart below her, muffled now, her uncle's voice and her father's voice. The particular register of 2 men moving past an uncomfortable moment. She opened the drawer in her nightstand and took out the jewelry box. The card from Ruth was still there. Hutchins and Greaves. Ellen Greaves. The phone number in Columbus. She held it in both hands for a long time. Then she put it in the pocket of her jeans, turned off the lamp, and lay down in the dark, with her shoes still on, listening to the sound of the dinner continuing without her, the muffled clink of silverware against the good plates. Margaret did not call Ellen Greaves the next morning. She attended the community college classes that Monday, and the Monday after, and for 2 years of Mondays after that. She did not talk to her parents about what Robert had said at the dinner. She did not ask them to explain or reconsider. She studied accounting and pre-law, carried a perfect grade point average, won a transfer scholarship that her academic advisor called the most competitive in the state, and in September of her 3rd year she walked onto the campus of Ohio State University as a junior. She called Ellen Greaves from a payphone outside the chemistry building on her first day. Ellen Greaves was a probate attorney, 62 years old at the time of that call, precise and unhurried in equal measure. Ruth Calloway had been her client for 11 years. Ellen told Margaret what Ruth had set up and asked her to come to the office when she could. When Margaret arrived 3 weeks later, Ellen placed a folder on the desk between them and walked her through it. Ruth had established an irrevocable educational trust in Margaret's name in 1987, the year after Margaret was born. It had grown, quietly and without fanfare, for 16 years. The trust documents specified that the principal and interest were to be released to Margaret in full upon her enrollment in an accredited 4-year undergraduate program. She was enrolled. She had been enrolled, technically, for 3 weeks. The amount was not enormous, but it was significant, $41,000, which in that year was sufficient to cover the remainder of Margaret's undergraduate education with a modest surplus for books and housing. Ellen Greaves produced a letter of instruction that Ruth had written in her own hand and updated in 1998, 2 years before she passed away. The letter was 3 paragraphs long. The first paragraph was about Margaret and what Ruth had seen in her since she was a small child in the back seat of the green Buick. The second paragraph was about a specific action Ruth wished Margaret to take, in her own time when she felt she was ready. The third paragraph was a single sentence. Margaret read the letter at the table across from Ellen Greaves, and she read it again. Her coffee went cold while she read it. She asked Ellen, did she know? Ellen said she believed so. Yes. Margaret folded the letter along its original crease and placed it in the pocket closest to her chest. For the next several years, she did nothing with the information that Ruth had given her, or nothing visible. She finished her undergraduate degree. She applied to law school at Ohio State and was admitted. She completed her JD in 3 years, graduated in the middle third of her class, which she found acceptable, and accepted a position with a mid-sized firm in Columbus that specialized in estate planning and probate litigation. She chose that specialty with the precision of someone who has known for a long time where they are going. She was good at the work. She had the focused attention that Dr. Anita Patel had observed when Margaret was 16 years old in a university laboratory, and that quality served her well in rooms full of documents and disagreements. She became a partner at 34. She began building something of her own at 37, a boutique firm with 2 associates and a particular reputation for untangling family trusts that had been mismanaged or manipulated. The work required patience. She had patience. During those years, her relationship with her family remained civil and thin. Holidays, phone calls on birthdays, brief visits to Brenton Falls, where the cream shutters were still on the house and the mailbox still looked like a covered bridge. Diane had moved to Columbus herself, as it happened, and had a marketing position at a regional firm. They were friendly at Christmas, distant at Easter. Margaret did not bring up the college fund. Neither did Diane. But Margaret was, during those years, doing what Ruth's letter had asked her to do. She was gathering the documentation. Not for a lawsuit. She was not interested in a lawsuit. Not for a confrontation at a dinner table. She had already had that experience, in a manner of speaking, and had found it incomplete. What Ruth had described in the second paragraph of her letter was something more specific. Ruth had maintained records. Ruth, who had been a methodical woman, had kept records of everything she believed had been misrepresented to her over the years during which she had added to her granddaughter's trust while other members of the family had periodically asked, with varying degrees of subtlety, whether Ruth intended to leave anything to Diane or to Gerald. Ruth had written down what they said. She had kept the letters. She had noted the dates. Ellen Greaves had the original documents in a fireproof file box that had sat in the back of her storage room for 4 years since Ruth's death. Margaret spent 6 months reviewing them. She cross-referenced Ruth's records against her own memory, against documents she requested from the college, against financial records that her position in estate law gave her the professional standing to pursue through proper channels. She found what she was looking for. She built the folder with the same care she brought to every professional case. She knew what each document meant. She knew what order to present them in. There was one evening in February, about 2 months before the April meeting, when she sat at her kitchen table at 2 a.m. with the folder open in front of her and a cup of tea she had forgotten to drink and thought, "I don't have to do this. Nothing compels me to do this. I have the life I built. I have the work I chose. The people who made these choices are old now, and I am not old yet." She sat with that thought for a long time. Then she thought about the painting in the Columbus Art Museum, the woman reading the letter by the window, the butter-colored light. She thought about being 9 years old and turning around to find her family 2 rooms ahead. She thought about September 4th and the creak of the staircase on the 3rd and 7th steps. She closed the folder. She opened it again. Then she called her father's brother, Robert, and asked him to arrange a family meeting at a venue of her choosing, explaining only that there was a matter related to their grandmother's estate that required the family's attention. Robert, who had lived for many years with the residue of what he had said at that dinner table, agreed without asking for details. She booked a conference room at the Columbus Estate Law Building where her firm kept office space. A round table, 6 chairs, high windows. A brass plaque beside the door with the name of the firm. She asked her associate Daniel to be present. She asked Ellen Greaves, who was now 79 and still practicing, to attend. And then she waited. The morning of the meeting was clear and cold for April, the kind of morning where the light has a new quality that did not exist in March, sharper and less forgiving. Margaret arrived at the conference room 45 minutes early. She placed 1 copy of the folder at her seat and no copies anywhere else. She asked Daniel to sit beside her and asked him not to speak unless she introduced him. She arranged 2 glasses of water on her side of the table. Ellen Greaves arrived at 9:15. She wore a charcoal blazer and carried a leather portfolio and moved with the unhurried certainty of someone who had sat in many rooms like this one and was no longer surprised by anything she found in them. She sat at Margaret's right. Robert and Carol arrived next. Robert in a good coat, Carol carrying a small handbag she kept on her lap. They nodded at Margaret and chose their seats with the careful neutrality of people who understood that they were present as witnesses and nothing more. Gerald and Patricia arrived at 9:28, 2 minutes before the appointed time. Because Gerald had always been a man who kept schedules. He wore a gray suit. Patricia had her pearl earrings on. The ones she wore for occasions she considered formal. Diane was last, at 9:32. She came in still unwinding a scarf, glanced around the table, and sat down next to their mother. Margaret thanked everyone for coming. She said she would be brief. She said that the meeting concerned a matter related to their grandmother Ruth Calloway's estate, which had never been formally addressed during or after the probate process in 1999. She introduced Ellen Greaves as Ruth's former attorney and her own legal advisor. She said that Ellen had administered a trust established in Margaret's name in 1987, that the trust had been distributed correctly, and that today's meeting was not about the trust itself. She opened the folder. She said that what today's meeting was about was a different matter. That between 1991 and 1998, while Ruth Calloway was alive, certain members of the family had approached Ruth on multiple occasions and made representations to her about Margaret's educational situation and about the necessity of redirecting Ruth's financial support elsewhere within the family. She said that Ruth had kept detailed records of every such conversation. She said those records were in the folder. She placed the first document in the center of the table. It was a letter dated June 14, 1994. It was signed by Patricia Calloway. It informed Ruth Calloway that Margaret had decided not to pursue a 4-year college program and was content with the community college path. And that under these circumstances, Ruth might consider redirecting any educational provisions she had made. Margaret said, for the record, that in June of 1994 she was 17 years old, she had not made any such decision, and no one had asked her. She watched her mother's face. The pearl earrings. The stillness. Gerald, said Margaret. She placed the second document on the table. It was Ruth's handwritten journal entry, dated July of that same year. Received Patricia's letter. Rang Gerald to ask directly about Margaret's choices. Gerald confirmed Patricia's account. Something is not right here. Margaret has never struck me as a child without ambitions. I will wait and I will watch. She placed the third document. Ruth's note from a visit in the fall of 1995 asked Margaret today, while Patricia was in the garden, whether she had considered not going to university. Margaret looked at me as though I had asked whether the sky was green. She said she had thought of nothing else for 3 years. I now understand what is happening in this family. She placed the fourth document, Ruth's updated letter of instruction to Ellen Greaves, written in 1997. Under no circumstances is the educational trust to be disclosed to Gerald or Patricia Calloway prior to Margaret's enrollment. I have reason to believe the information would be used to accelerate the redistribution of the college fund held jointly, leaving Margaret without recourse. The room was quiet in the way that certain rooms go quiet. Not the quiet of nothing happening, but the quiet of many things happening simultaneously inside people who are not yet speaking. Carol's handbag was very still on her lap. Robert looked at the table. Diane's scarf was still in her hands, unfolded now, twisted at one end. Margaret said she was not there to make accusations. She said she was there because her grandmother had spent the last years of her life watching a situation unfold that grieved her, and because Ruth had left a record of that grief for a reason, and because that reason was not, she believed, to let the record sit in a file box for 25 years. She said she imagined her parents might have some things they wanted to say. Gerald looked at the folder. Then he looked at his hands. Then he said, "That was a long time ago, Margaret." She said, "Yes, it was." He said, "We did what we thought was best." She said, "I know you believed that. But I want you to know, and I want everyone in this room to know what the record shows. That you told my grandmother I had made choices I had not made. That you told her I did not want what I had wanted my entire life. That because of what you told her, a woman who loved me spent the last years of her life wondering whether she was doing the right thing. I am telling you today, for her, that she was." She closed the folder. She said, "I do not want anything from you. I am not filing a claim. I am not asking for an apology. Because I have learned that apologies for things like this are usually more for the person giving them than the person receiving them. I am here because Ruth kept these records, and she kept them for a reason, and I am honoring what she started." Ellen Greaves said, "I was asked to be present today to confirm that the documents Margaret has presented are authentic copies of materials held in the original file." "They are," Robert said, very quietly. "Good Lord." Diane set down her scarf. Margaret thanked everyone for their time. She stood and picked up the folder. She shook Ellen Greaves's hand. She nodded to Robert and Carol. She did not look at her parents or her sister as she walked out of the room. The light in the hallway was the kind that came through high windows in the morning, the butter-colored kind. She did not stop to notice it. She had a 10 o'clock meeting at her office across town, and she was going to be on time. There is a quality to the consequences that followed the April meeting that is consistent with the kind of exposure that does not announce itself loudly. Nothing fell apart dramatically, nothing caught fire overnight. What happened was quieter and more durable than that. Patricia and Gerald Calloway were known in Brenton Falls as people who keep houses with good paint and attend church on Sundays tend to be known by a certain layer of the community consistently for a long time. Robert had grown up in that community. Robert and Carol attended the same church. Carol was on the Women's Auxiliary Committee with two women who had been at the September 4th dinner, including Donna Fielding, who had reached for her water glass on that particular evening. The things that are known in small communities tend to travel along the paths that small communities have always used. There is no drama in this, no cruelty, only the way that truth moves when it has been held still for a very long time. Patricia resigned from the Women's Auxiliary in June, which was noted. The church community is a resilient institution, and it has its own ways of registering a thing without discussing it directly. Gerald retired from his position at the lending department the following autumn. He had been planning this retirement for some time, and no one suggested it was connected to anything, because in a town like Brenton Falls, connections are understood without being said aloud. There was a dinner that Gerald and Patricia had hosted annually for decades, a summer cookout for a dozen families, a standing tradition. It was not hosted that year, or the year following. The families who had attended it did not call to ask why. They found other summer arrangements. Diane, for her part, went quiet. Margaret did not hear from her for several months after the April meeting. When a text message finally arrived in August, it said only, "I didn't know what Mom told Grandma Ruth. I want you to know that." Margaret read the message and set her phone down and thought about it for a day before responding. She wrote back, "I believe you." They met for coffee once that fall at a cafe on the Short North in Columbus, and they talked for 2 hours. Diane cried at one point. Margaret did not, but she placed her hand briefly over her sister's on the table, which she had not done since they were very young. There was no dramatic reconciliation. There was only the beginning of something that might, in time, become honest. Margaret did not file anything, contact anyone, or say a word about the meeting publicly. She went to work. She handled her cases. She expanded her firm by one associate and began taking on pro bono cases for elderly clients in contested family estate situations, which she found was the most useful thing she could think of to do with what she had learned. Ellen Greaves retired in November and sent Margaret a card that said, simply, "Ruth would have been proud." Margaret put the card in a frame on the wall of her office, between the photograph of her research cohort from the summer she was 16 and a printout of a journal article she had cited in her law school thesis on irrevocable trust provisions. On the last Sunday of December that year, Margaret hosted a dinner. Her kitchen table seated 6 if you pulled in the chairs from the living room, which she did. The tablecloth was the one she had bought at a market 3 years ago, pale linen with a faint yellow stripe, slightly too big for the table, falling in soft folds to the chairs. Daniel and his partner Yvonne brought wine and a cheese board. Her neighbor from across the hall, a retired schoolteacher named June Hartley, who was 81 years old and had a particular laugh that sounded like a door swinging open on a warm morning, brought a dish of roasted parsnips because she said a winter table needed something honest. Dr. Anita Patel, who was now 68 and consulted for a foundation that funded high school research programs, was in Columbus for the week and had accepted without hesitation. And Diane was there, sitting at the corner of the table, her coat on the hook by the door where the umbrellas lived, wearing a green sweater that Margaret had not seen before. Margaret made a roast. She had always been a competent cook in the way she was competent at most things, methodically, without fuss. The kitchen smelled of rosemary and something sweet, a red wine reduction she had started on the stove that morning. When they sat down, June said a grace, short and sincere, the kind that does not require you to believe anything specific to receive it. There was bread. There was wine. There were 6 people around a table that was slightly too small for 6, which meant their elbows were close together and the conversation stayed warm without effort. At some point in the evening, between the main course and the parsnips, Margaret raised her glass and said only this, to Ruth. Everyone at the table raised their glass, including Diane, who had never met Ruth Calloway as an adult. Margaret looked at her sister over the rim of her glass for a moment, and Diane looked back, and something passed between them that did not have a name yet. Something that was not forgiveness exactly, and not the absence of pain exactly, but was beginning to look like the space where those things might eventually live. Outside, the December light was gone, and the street was quiet, and through the window above the sink, a single lamp in an apartment across the way made a small yellow square in the dark. June told a story about a student she had taught in 1983 who had become a circuit court judge, and how she had seen his name in the paper last week, and how that was the kind of thing that made the whole enterprise feel worth it. The bread was gone before the conversation slowed. No one mentioned Brenton Falls. If you are watching this and you recognize yourself in this story, if you have ever sat at a table where you were the one who did not quite fit, or been told that your ambitions were something other than what they were, or watched someone else receive what was meant for you while the adults in the room looked at their plates, then this story is for you. And what follows is not advice so much as the things that Margaret, and women like her, have learned to hold on to. You are allowed to know what you know. The years of small moments that add up to a pattern, they are real, even when the people who caused them have agreed, among themselves, to remember things differently. You do not need them to confirm what you experienced in order for it to have been true. The record does not require their signature. You are allowed to prepare quietly. The impulse to respond immediately, to match emotion with emotion, to demand acknowledgement at the moment the wound is freshest, that impulse is human. And it is understandable, and it will cost you more than it gains you. The most powerful thing in many situations is not speed. It is patience in the company of a clear intention. You are allowed to accept help from the people who truly see you, even if they are few. Ruth Calloway was one woman with a file box and a green Buick, and the good sense to write things down. One person who sees you clearly is worth more than a room full of people who see only what they need to see. You are allowed to name the truth without requiring it to be an act of war. Margaret did not go to that conference room seeking destruction. She went because her grandmother had started a record and asked her to finish it. The truth was not a weapon. It was simply what had happened, placed on a table where the people who needed to see it could no longer look away. And you are allowed, perhaps this is the most important thing, to build the life you intended for yourself, even after the early chapters were written by someone else. The community college years are not a detour in Margaret's story. They are the years that made her a different kind of attorney than she might have been otherwise, and she knows it. The setback is part of the architecture. If this story gave you something to hold on to today, please share it with someone who might need it. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Where you are, what stayed with you, and if you would like to hear more stories like this one, the subscribe button is there when you are ready. Ruth would have said, "You are the kind of person the world needs more of." She was right.